This video is brought to you by my Patreon subscribers. Thank you so much for keeping the channel going. And before I begin, I just want to say that this video deals with a number of sensitive subjects. In June of 2020, a petition was started on change.org to save Splash Mountain. This was in response to another petition that asked Disney to retheme the classic theme park ride to The Princess and the Frog, something that many Disney fans were asking for at the time. Splash Mountain wasn't saved. Later that month, Disney announced that they had actually already had plans to retheme the ride to The Princess and the Frog, and about 2 years later, they shared the name for the new ride, Tiana's Bayou Adventure. And not only is the Save Splash Mountain movement still going strong, but it's grown into something more sinister. But to talk about that, we have to know where this all started.
Zip-a-Dee-Doo-Dah, zip-a-dee-ay, wonderful feeling, wonderful day.
In June, there was a Twitter account created with the tagline, "First they came for Splash and I said nothing," a reference to the First They Came poem about World War II. The actual tweets are interesting. Pronoun Mountain. What happened to a woman's right to choose to watch Song of the South? Codify Splash Mountain. A lot of people support Splash Mountain closing. A lot of people also support Hitler. I don't judge those who wish Splash Mountain gone, but God will. Honestly, it seems like a parody. I mean, there are people who like Splash Mountain and don't want it to go, but is it really that serious? Well, yes, for some people it is, and regardless about whether or not this specific account is parody, it isn't too different from many things I've read about saving Splash Mountain. But let's go back to the beginning. Splash Mountain is a log flume that originally premiered at Disneyland in California in 1989, and since then, there have been versions of the ride built at the Magic Kingdom in Florida and Tokyo Disneyland. And it's a good ride. Actually, it's a great ride. That's what makes talking about Splash Mountain so difficult. It's often considered one of the best Disney attractions ever. It's ambitious, it's long, and it has a perfect mix of musical fun and thrills that makes it an ideal example of what makes Disney parks so special. But there's something rotten at the core of Splash Mountain. While brainstorming ways to bring guests to the less popular Bear Country part of Disneyland, Imagineer Tony Baxter had an idea. Recycle animatronic characters from the also not popular America Sings to save money, and create a ride that would bring more guests to Bear Country. And he soon found the perfect movie for it. Song of the South, Disney's movie that mixed live action with animation to tell Brer Rabbit folklore stories from the perspective of Uncle Remus. Many people think of the movie today as problematic and outdated, but to be clear, it was also highly controversial when it came out in 1946, but more on that later. Not only did the movie feature one of Disney's most well-known songs, Zip-a-Dee-Doo-Dah, it also had anthropomorphic animal characters that fit the style of America Sings, and it fit the request for a log flume that Dick Nunis, then president of Walt Disney Attractions, asked for. So it was settled. Recycle old parts and use Song of the South to create a new ride for Disneyland. It would take a few years for it to come to fruition due to other concepts like Star Tours taking priority, but it eventually happened. It was originally called Zip-a-Dee River Run, but in a very odd decision, then CEO Michael Eisner asked for the ride to be renamed so it could be used to promote the almost unrelated movie Splash.
Zip-a-dee-Doo-Dah, zip-a-dee-ay, Mr. Mango on my shoulder.
So Splash Mountain was born, and it was a hit. As I said, many people love Splash Mountain. It has a catchy soundtrack, scenic design, and just enough thrills to make it an aspirational ride for kids who weren't quite ready to ride intense roller coasters yet. And in the world of theme parks where rides are usually mere minutes long, having a 9-minute ride made it another long Disney classic. And like many Disney rides that are in multiple parks, there are little differences between each version that make them unique. For example, the Florida one is a bit longer than the original, coming out at over 11 minutes. And for the soundtrack, though the arrangements of the Disneyland version fit the nearby New Orleans Square part of the park, the Florida version is much different. Sound designer and ex-Imagineer Greg Meter has said that the Florida arrangements were recorded in Nashville, with local country and folk musicians adding their own style and flair to each song, making it sound more fitting in the Frontierland section of the park. course, there's the Tokyo Disneyland version that has slight differences than the others. It uses the same soundtrack as the Florida one, but the exterior looks different, and the ride clocks in at 10 minutes, and it has 4 drops, one more than Disneyland, but one less than the Magic Kingdom. After being such a success, Splash Mountain was completely incorporated into the Disney brand. Not only was Zip-a-Dee-Doo-Dah played throughout the parks, but Splash Mountain was firmly considered a must-do for the whole family. I'm talking a lot about the success of the ride because it's often what people think about when wanting to save the attraction. After all, why would Disney want to remove one of their most successful rides? The ride's popular and not offensive like its source material, so why change it? But that's just not true. To believe that Splash Mountain doesn't have the things that made Song of the South controversial is a misunderstanding. Disney definitely tried to separate the ride from the movie. There's a reason why they didn't use all of the songs from the film and avoided the live-action parts. Despite that, though, they failed. And not only did they fail, but some of the worst parts of the movie and what it represents are still there. So, what is Song of the South? It's a 1946 Disney movie that focuses on the Uncle Remus fables. Played by James Baskett, Remus lives on a plantation in Georgia with other formerly enslaved people. In his spare time, he serves as a sort of father figure to Johnny, the white child living at the plantation whose father isn't home. Uncle Remus entertains Johnny and the other children with stories about Brer Rabbit and his escapades, often with each story having a theme and moral focus. Walt Disney had wanted to make a film about the Brer Rabbit stories for a long time, having grown up with them as a kid. The stories themselves come from Black American folklore, but Walt was familiar with them via Joel Chandler Harris, the white writer who transcribed and adapted them from stories he heard from Southern Black people. He made up Uncle Remus as a way to sequence the stories, saying that the character was inspired by many wise black men who he had met. When he published the stories in 1880, they instantly became a huge hit, and soon Joel Chandler Harris was a household name. And before his death in 1908, he would publish 9 Uncle Remus books. While some people think of Chandler Harris as being a hero for preserving black folklore by documenting stories that had mainly been passed down orally, the actual books he published show the power structures of his day. Though he was someone who aligned himself with the New South, a progressive movement to create a more equal and fair society after the horrors of slavery and the Civil War, his writing reflected otherwise. One of the biggest influences on his Uncle Remus books was Uncle Tom's Cabin. Despite the latter being an anti-slavery story, Chandler Harris said that not only did he think it was a wonderful defense of slavery, but that the real moral that Mrs. Stowe's book teaches is that the realities of slavery, under the best and happiest conditions, possess a romantic beauty and tenderness all on their own. And keep in mind that he considered the Uncle Remus books a companion to Uncle Tom's Cabin, and we can assume he meant his interpretation of it. This makes it difficult to believe that his only aim of documenting the Brer Rabbit stories was to preserve black culture. And then there's the dialect. Though some at the time praised the accuracy of the deep Southern black dialect Chandler Harris wrote the stories in, others saw and still see it as a racist attempt to not document a dialect, but preserve a white man's view of the dialect, influenced by his own prejudices and views of the people he claimed to be inspired by. And when you consider the fact that the Brer Rabbit stories often deal with some subversive element of the underdog prevailing, the entire premise of the Uncle Remus books becomes flawed. As a white man interviewing enslaved and formerly enslaved black people, there's no afterthought or analysis of whether or not the stories told to him were actually accurate or influenced by his presence there as a white man. Our folklore has been ridiculed and tampered with, and this is very serious because folklore is at the heart of self-expression, and therefore at the heart of self-acceptance. It is full of the possibilities of misinterpretation, full of subtleties and danger. Joel Chandler Harris and I were raised in the same town, although nearly 100 years apart. As far as I'm concerned, he stole a good part of my heritage. In creating Uncle Remus, he placed an effective barrier between me and the stories that meant so much to me. The stories that could have meant so much to all of our children. The stories that they would have heard from us and not from Walt Disney. Disney secured the rights to the Joel Chandler Harris books in 1939, and they began filming for Song of the South 5 years later. As I mentioned, James Baskett, known previously at Disney for his role as one of the controversial crows in Dumbo, was cast as Uncle Remus. giving a charismatic performance. Cherry-picking stories from the original books, the film seamlessly blended animation and live action. Uncle Remus would tell stories to Johnny that would give morals to help him in his life, aided by vivid animated sequences. Fans of Song of the South argue that the film depicts a touching friendship between an older black man and a young white boy, but this relationship cannot be removed from its setting, which is an old plantation where Remus is not technically enslaved, but formerly was, and for some reason not only continues to stay there, but maintains a seemingly subservient relationship with the white family at the plantation. Historian Patricia A. Turner described this as one of the main problems with the film, even saying that Disney's 20th century recreation of Harris's frame story is much more heinous than the original. She also criticized the framing of the story and points out that while the Joel Chandler Harris stories are set in the Reconstruction era, Song of the South makes few subtle references to this, showing audiences a surreal time where black people lived in slave quarters on a post-slavery plantation for no reward that's visible to the audience. Fans of the movie will point out that it is technically set in the Reconstruction era as well, but the movie does little to clarify this. And after the movie came out in 1946, the executive secretary of the NAACP, Walter Francis White, contacted newspapers to share his concern. In an effort neither to offend audiences in the North or South, Song of the South helps to perpetuate a dangerously glorified picture of slavery. On her podcast, You Must Remember This, Karina Longworth has a fantastic 6-episode series on Song of the South that goes super in-depth and was a huge resource while making this video, and I highly recommend you check it out. In one of the episodes, she takes a closer look at the song Let the Rain Pour Down, which was written by 2 white men to be performed by a black chorus. She highlights a part of the lyrics that seems to show the true relationship of the story.
When you're aching with the misery, when you're old and gray, then you better be thankful that he let you stay.
She talks about the obvious reading of he referring to God, but when placed in the context of the movie, that seems a bit far-fetched. When sung by formerly enslaved black workers who just so happen to be working on the same plantation voluntarily, it seems more like it could refer to the master-slave dynamic. The capital H in the lyrics seems obsolete, as the film suggests something else. And so many people think the film was set during slavery when it technically wasn't. Though the setting supposedly tells a story of the Reconstruction era South, the music, script, visuals, and characters tell another tale. Oh, and for those who think that Splash Mountain is completely removed from the live-action parts of the movie, you can still hear Let the Rain Pour Down in the cue for the ride, albeit without the lyrics. Other songs, such as That's What Uncle Remus Said, can also be heard, but we'll get to the other songs later. It's impossible to talk about the music of Song of the South without talking about Zip-a-Dee-Doo-Dah. As I mentioned earlier, it's not only the most famous song from the film, but it's one of the most well-known Disney songs of all time. It won an Academy Award for Best Original Song, and over the years it's represented not just this movie, but Disney as a whole.
It happened on one of them Zip-a-Dee-Doo-Dah days.
Zip-a-dee-doo-dah, zip-a-dee-ay.
According to Disney historian Jim Korkis, Walt Disney came up with the title in a similar vein to other nonsense words that would make it into later Disney films, such as Bibbidi-Bobbidi-Boo and Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. The song is exuberant. A Zip-a-Dee-Doo-Dah day is a happy one, so it's a declaration of all things joyful. But it actually represents something more troubling. You see, these songs don't exist in a vacuum, and the title, as Walt Disney said it, is largely thought to be an interpolation of a chorus from a famous minstrel song. Minstrel shows were created and performed as a way to denigrate black people, and this song represents an incredibly harmful stereotype that became a recurring character in minstrel shows. Some minstrel performers say they wanted to pay tribute to the black musicians who they learned their music from, but the art form itself is so built upon racist stereotypes that it's impossible to separate it from systemic racism. We believe the Hutchinson family does not object to the Virginia minstrels, Christie's minstrels, the Ethiopian serenaders, or any of the filthy scum of white society, who have stolen from us a complexion denied to them by nature, in which to make money and pander to the corrupt taste of their white fellow citizens. Minstrel was so pervasive in early 1900s US culture that there's no doubt Walt Disney was aware of the implications. After all, he even featured minstrel for an entire Mickey Mouse short, including the company's mascot getting in blackface. And the song that Zip-a-Dee-Doo-Dah interpolated is also known with other lyrics as Turkey in the Straw. And if you're a Disney fan, you know that Mickey Mouse's breakout hit Steamboat Willie featured the same melody. The movie's framing of Uncle Remus on a plantation where he just so happened to be formerly enslaved perpetuates a grim side of US history. The mythology of pro-Confederate arguments, the rehabilitation of the dehumanizing and murderous institution of slavery is not new. In fact, when enslaved people were freed, the revisionism about the country's past had already begun. When talking about Song of the South in 2020, then Disney CEO Bob Iger said that the film would never make it to Disney+, not even with the disclaimer that most problematic films on the platform get. He said it was because the movie was not appropriate in today's world. But as I've shown in this video, Song of the South wasn't appropriate when it was released either. The NAACP was upset about the film, and known communist Maurice Rapf was brought in by Disney to help fix the script, which was a big deal considering how anti-communist Walt was. Fixing the script was impossible, and after the film came out, Rapf denounced it and there were protests. And each time the film has been re-released, controversy always came with it. After Michael Eisner became Disney CEO in the 80s, it was removed from distribution. Though Disney tried to sift out the film's problematic elements when making Splash Mountain, the fact that Zip-a-Dee-Doo-Dah is the ride's theme song shows how they failed, and it shows how impossible that task was in the first place. And Disney knows this, as they've been quietly removing the song from background loops and other parts of the company over the past few years. Song of the South would not exist without problematic racist traditions, so thinking it's possible to separate the movie from them to make a ride is missing the point. The people trying to save Splash Mountain know the politics. There are some people who just genuinely love the ride, but many others see the removal of Splash Mountain as some loss to the woke mob. They think that Disney is trying to erase history by attacking a ride that doesn't have anything to do with racism. As we've already seen, this is just not true. Splash Mountain is a failed attempt at removing problematic elements from a film that is inherently problematic. And when you have uncredited Uncle Remus quotes throughout the queue of the ride, it's clear that the ride is not only built on the film's animated parts. But the Save Splash Mountain people are right about one thing. The ride represents so much more than just a movie. On its own, Song of the South already preserves a lot of mythology about the US South and race relations, but the ride takes it even further. You see, the ride is known for its tunes from Song of the South, but that's not the only music you hear. Like many Disney rides, there's often cue music that's piped into the line in the ride's general area, immersing you in the mood and environment. At Disneyland, this means mostly music from the film, but in Florida, it's a bit different. Since the soundtrack is more country and folk music based, it features songs from those traditions in addition to the movie's music. And it features a variety of minstrel songs. Without the lyrics, you wouldn't know, but there are a variety of minstrel songs hidden in the ride's cue music, parts of the US tradition of folk music that, just like the ride, were attempted to be sanitized, but to no avail. And in Florida, whose state song is still a minstrel song, it hits different. But to understand why, we have to dig deeper. If you go on the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences website, you'll find a children's section that has songs. If you go to the patriotic songs part, you'll see Dixie, a song about wanting to be back in the land of cotton. On the surface, this might seem like a harmless children's song, but it's actually one of the most controversial songs in US history. On the website, the song is credited to Daniel Decatur Emmett, who was the founder of the first blackface minstrel troupe, the Virginia Minstrels. But the website doesn't mention that. Instead, it just says he was enlisted in a minstrel group when they stopped in Mount Vernon and needed a replacement for a sick player, beginning a long musical career. That isn't really true. Though he was recruited by a circus, the origin of minstrel shows is largely attributed to his work with the Virginia Minstrels. And so by removing that history, the official government website makes it seem like Emmett had a passive role in minstrel, instead of being one of the originators of the art form. The website also makes a note that it was Abraham Lincoln's favorite song, but doesn't highlight that Dixie was and is an anthem for the Confederacy before, during, and after the US Civil War. It mentions that Emmett was criticized for writing a song associated with the South, but saying associated is much different than it being the unofficial anthem of the Confederacy. And this isn't even taking into account the complicated origins of the song. Many people say that Emmett didn't even write it himself, instead arguing that he either learned it from or co-composed it with the Snowden Family Band, an African-American musical group. There is no smoking gun concerning Dixie. Early minstrels themselves claimed to be authentic delineators of the music, dance, and oratory of Black America, but definitive proof of sources has long been elusive. Dixie would eventually become a main staple of minstrel shows, and it's arguably the most popular minstrel song of all time, and its association today is mainly with white supremacy, as its ties to the Confederacy and minstrel inherently links it to the power structures that both histories tried to uphold. But that doesn't stop it from being in the children's section on a government website, and that's the same fate of many minstrel songs. Some are completely stripped of racism, some partially, some not at all, but many of them end up in children's songbooks and classrooms where they're removed from their original context. Even if they're not doing blackface, parts of minstrel are still part of US culture. And you can hear Dixie and a few other minstrel songs while waiting in line for the Florida or Tokyo versions of Splash Mountain, showing that the ride is much more than just a supposedly sanitized adaptation of Song of the South. Splash Mountain does everything the original film did, even if it's more subtle. It upholds myths about racism in the traditional US American way. That is, making racist tropes so deeply ingrained and normalized in culture, to the point where if you acknowledge them, you're not only painted as being too sensitive, but also disrupting the status quo. And if you point out that the theme song for Splash Mountain is inherently tied to minstrelsy and racism, well, you're just not having a Zip-a-Dee-Doo-Dah day. So, with all of this historical context, how did the fans of Song of the South respond to criticisms about the movie? Well, they just ignore them. It's quite easy to. The movie is technically set during a Reconstruction era, so it can't be about slavery, right? And Joel Chandler Harris wasn't appropriating and misrepresenting dialects. He was just trying to preserve Black US history. And supposedly, any other accusations of racism are just reading too far into it. How do I know this? Well, I used to be a fan of Song of the South. I've been a fan of Disney from a young age, especially the beginning of the company and their early films, and my favorite ride growing up was Splash Mountain. When I was 13 and found out that my favorite Disney ride was based off a movie, I just had to see it. The actual film itself is boring. I liked James Baskett's acting, but would mainly just skip through to watch the animated segments with the songs I liked a lot. And this was in the early 2000s, so the only info out there about this movie was on fan sites and forums. And unsurprisingly, those places were incredibly biased and didn't talk about the actual history, but instead misinformation that attempted to remove the racist context of the movie. This level of denial isn't uncommon in the Disney fandom, and it brings up a huge conflict that isn't just about Song of the South and Splash Mountain. When you have a media empire started by a conservative, white, cis, straight man from the early 1900s, the attitudes and morals of that company reflect that. So we have queer-coded villains and early films that make fun of gay people. And when you go to the theme parks, there are many reminders of racist stereotypes on rides. It's not just Splash Mountain. And when you grow up with genuine nostalgia for these rides, someone attacking them feels like a personal attack. And that's wrong. Not the criticism, but the nostalgia. The nostalgia surrounding Splash Mountain is the reason why people are willing to overlook aspects of its source material. And for people like me who grew up in white suburbia, loving Splash Mountain, and having virtually no experience looking at media critically, it's the gateway to misinformation and promoting a harmful movie. Oh, and we haven't even talked about the title song of the film, which is also heard in the cue for Splash.
This heart of mine is in the heart of Dixie, that's where I belong, singing a song, the song of the song.
The Song of the South isn't really named, but I guess you can interpret that the song itself is it, but I don't think so. Dixie will live forever. It's the Song of the South. The Save Splash Mountain movement has changed a lot since it began in 2020. It's important to not forget the optics of the original announcement. After weeks of fans making petitions, Disney announced the ride during the George Floyd protests, one of the defining moments in modern US culture. Of course, changing a theme park ride was not part of the protests, but since Song of the South and Splash Mountain are so controversial and the products of racism in rewriting history, I think it's impossible to view the change outside of the broader movement to address racial injustice in US culture. People wanted to change the ride during a period of civil rights advocacy, and the opposition to that was about keeping things the way they were. And Disney retheming a ride in the US parks that's just one huge reference to a film with such a controversial past was a sign of cultural progress in the company. In this context, saving Splash Mountain just means saving the status quo. And in the past 2 years, it's really gotten out of control. I'm sure there are still some fans who are only thinking of a theme park ride and refuse to engage with the problematic elements. But the Save Splash Mountain movement on a whole seems to have become something more sinister, a pocket of the Disney fandom that's just a conservative reactionary response to bring the country back to more harrowing times. And I'm talking about what Song of the South represents, but also just the more heinous, racist things said by Save Splash Mountain accounts that have nothing to do with the ride, but just prejudice. They know what they're doing. When I was about 16, I started leaving the Disney fandom. What was once inspiring became disturbing. As I became more interested in social justice and history, it was impossible to ignore the incredible flaws of the company's movies and theme park rides. And in the early 2000s, most Disney fan sites and forums that I was on leaned very much towards the conservative side. On some sites, you couldn't mention gay days without a swarm of hate comments, and for someone coming to terms with my queerness, I felt pushed out. And of course, you weren't allowed to talk about Song of the South in the wrong way. And by that, I mean criticize it at all. As I learned more about the history of racism and how that influenced the film, the Disney stories about it fell apart. And it was clear that growing up with white privilege made it not only possible to watch the film without the racist history behind it, but it also laid the groundwork for history to be rewritten. When I thought of the movie, I didn't think of the music. I thought of the protesters. And Splash Mountain was no longer inspired by the film. It was a continuation of it, controversy and all. So, by the time I finished high school, I was out of the Disney fandom, and would be for a while. In my last year and a half or so at college, I fell back into it through YouTube, and specifically video essays. There were so many great videos being made about film and theme park history, and it really got me to remember the parts of Disney that I genuinely still enjoyed. But it was the videos that critiqued Disney that got me to truly look at it in a different way. I saw people talking about Disney's past in a critical way that didn't feel cynical, but realistic. Sure, to this day, the Disney fandom still has a conservative slant, but I feel like it's not as all-encompassing as it used to be. Splash Mountain is slated to close sometime in 2023, and it'll reopen in late 2024 as Tiana's Bayou Adventure, and I'm incredibly happy about that. The Princess and the Frog is one of my favorite Disney films of all time, and I'm so glad that Tiana and friends will get their own ride. In a post for the Disney Parks blog, Carmen Smith shared news about the ride and highlighted why it's so important. Guests are in for a true treat with local flavor when Tiana's Bayou Adventure opens in late 2024. As Charita Carter said, in many ways, Tiana's Bayou Adventure is a love letter to New Orleans. Like the musical city that inspired this attraction, Tiana's second act is about a community working in harmony to achieve something extraordinary. She reminds us of an immutable truth we can all relate to. If you do your best each and every day, good things are sure to come your way. And that's a melody we can all sing along to. To be able to join New Orleans in the celebration of Black joy as we bring Tiana's story to its roots is a full circle moment I'm so proud to realize. As Disney continues to embrace more representation and social justice, I hope we can continue to see more rides, movies, and shows that truly reflect the diverse fan base that loves Disney for a variety of different reasons. So I hope that Tiana's Bayou Adventure is not only a great example of how to repurpose an old attraction, but also pave the way for fixing other parts of the theme parks. And though as of right now, Tokyo Disneyland Splash Mountain is here to stay, maybe it will change too. And maybe Splash Mountain's name referencing Splash is actually fitting. A movie about a mermaid and transformation, showing how people can change and truly become someone else. I think it's ironic that a ride doomed from the start by its source material is named after something that embraces change. But of course, almost all of the comments in the Disney Parks blog post are about how upset people are to see Splash Mountain go. And at this point, if you aren't interested in learning about the history that makes this ride so controversial, I don't even know what I can say other than I'm sorry your favorite ride is going away. But Splash Mountain can't be saved.
Don't save Splash Mountain. It was never here to stay. Don't save Splash Mountain. Tiana's on her way. Don't save Splash Mountain.